Have you ever sat beside someone who was about to die? Their breath becomes shallow. Their grip loosens. And then stillness, that silence, that haunting stillness. It pierces through the heart like no sound ever could. It's in that moment when the body no longer moves, when the warmth begins to fade, that something in us breaks. Not just because they are gone, but because it confronts a fear we've been running from our entire lives. The fear of vanishing, of being erased, of becoming nothing. This fear, buried beneath our daily distractions, is what drives much of our restlessness, why we chase status, security, even spirituality. We are haunted by a single question, often unspoken. What happens when it all ends? But what if the fear is built on a misunderstanding? What if there is no end at all? What if death is not the full stop, but just a comma? Not an erasure, but a transformation. You see, from the moment we're born, we're taught to see the world in dualities, beginning and end, life and death, coming and going. We celebrate arrivals. We mourn departures. We say things like, "He came into this world and she left us too soon." But who exactly is coming and going? When a baby is born, we say, "A new life has arrived." But from where? Was that being created out of nothing? And when someone dies, we say, "He's gone." But where to? Is what they truly are gone or just unseen? Think of a wave rising in the ocean. To the casual eye, it appears, forming, swelling, cresting, then crashing, disappearing. But did it ever really come or go? The wave is made of water. From start to finish, it is never separate from the ocean. It may take on a form, dance for a while under the sun, then merge again, yet it never truly departs. What we fear as death is like fearing the waves return to the sea. But we don't see it that way, because we've mistaken the wave for who we are. We think we are this body, this name, this personality, this brief, visible rise. And when the wave dissolves, we panic. It's gone. Not realizing we were never the wave. We are the ocean. This illusion of coming and going is the seed of our suffering. It makes us grip tightly to moments, afraid they'll slip away. It causes us to fear old age, illness, and loss, as if they are signs of failure or punishment instead of natural transitions. But if we could see clearly, really clearly, we'd recognize that nothing ever truly arrives and nothing ever truly leaves. It only appears and disappears depending on the conditions. A flame, for instance, seems to vanish when you blow it out. But is it truly gone? Or did the conditions for its visibility simply end? The heat is still in the air. The carbon still in the smoke. The energy still moving through the world in unseen ways. In the same way, what we call death is not disappearance. It is a shift in form. The body returns to dust. The breath returns to wind. The mind, like mist, disperses into the greater sky of awareness. The Buddha once taught, "There is no coming, no going, no after, no before." These are only illusions conjured by the mind, clinging to labels, time, and false boundaries. But that raises a deeper question. If we are not this body, not this rise and fall, then who are we? That is where the real journey begins, not in memorizing doctrines or chasing beliefs, but in sitting quietly with ourselves, watching the waves of thought rise and fall, until we see beneath them something still, something vast. You are not the wave that rises today and disappears tomorrow. You are the water itself, unbroken, unborn, undying. This understanding, if deeply touched, is not just a poetic idea, it is liberation. Because when the fear of death fades, life begins to open in a completely new way. You no longer live to protect yourself. You live to express your nature, to serve, to love, to awaken others to their own freedom. Just like a flame lights another without losing itself. You shine not to survive but to illuminate. But let's be honest. Most of us don't feel like the ocean. We feel small, isolated, terrified of the moment everything we know disappears. And that's okay, because even in the fear, even in the panic, even when the wave forgets its water, the ocean never forgets. It waits patiently for you to remember. There is a way to remember. A path not of belief but of insight, of seeing directly into the nature of things, of looking at the leaf, the breath, the tear rolling down a cheek, and realizing this too is the infinite dancing in form. The journey into this truth isn't about escaping death. It's about waking up to a reality where death has no power, not because we deny it, but because we finally understand it. And once we understand, we begin to live not with panic but with peace, not rushing but resting, not clinging but embracing, because we know there is no real coming and no real going. Only the ocean, flowing, shaping, returning, forever whole. It starts so early, before we know our own name, before we even understand what a self is. The world begins to whisper a story into our ears. You were born, this is you. That's yours, that's not. Piece by piece, word by word, we start building an identity. Like clay molded by unseen hands. Parents, teachers, culture, language, they don't mean to deceive us. But the illusion takes shape just the same. You look into a mirror. Someone says, that's you. You point to a photo and say, that was me when I was little. And without question, you believe it. But pause for a moment. That photo cell's long gone. That body entirely replaced over the years. Not one atom the same. So what exactly remains from that you who was born? The idea of being born feels so solid, so unquestionable. There's a birth certificate. There are baby photos. There's a name you've answered to since you could speak. But from the lens of Dharma, all of it is constructed, not false in the sense of imaginary, but false in the sense of mistaken. Mistaken for something fixed, when in truth it's ever-changing. You weren't born out of nothing. No, you suddenly appeared. Just like the sunrise doesn't bring the sun into existence. It only reveals it. The moment we say, I was born, we've already stepped into the illusion of separateness, of beginning, of permanence. But what was actually born? A body, a bundle of cells with a heartbeat. The body is not you. It's a temporary vessel of earth, water, fire, and air. Its form shaped by generations of genetics, karma, and conditions. A magnificent orchestra of elements in motion. Yet we point to it and say, this is me. Then there's the mind, thoughts, memories, emotions. A parade of impressions flowing endlessly like a river. We recall the past and say, that was me. But even your thoughts are not the same from one breath to the next. So again, what is truly you? And what exactly was born? This illusion began when consciousness met form, when name met sensation, when the five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness came together. And with that fusion came ignorance, not stupidity, but forgetfulness, a forgetting of our true nature, of the boundless awareness that has no beginning, no end. And so the drama begins. We grow up, we succeed, we fail, we fall in love, we get hurt, and we carry all of it in a bag we call me. But the Buddha taught that this bag is empty, not in a nihilistic sense, but in the most liberating sense, empty of a separate, permanent self. The I we protect, glorify, or punish, it's just a phantom, a useful convention but not the truth. To believe I was born is to believe that you are a separate drop of water, falling from the sky into the ocean. But in truth, you've always been water. The drop was just a temporary shape. Still, the illusion is powerful. It fuels our ambitions. It fuels our fears. It even fuels religion and the desperate longing to be saved. As if I must be preserved eternally in some perfect, untouched form. But what if freedom is not in preservation, but in release? What if the goal isn't to survive forever, but to awaken from the mistaken identity that suffers? The idea of I was born is comforting, in a way. It gives us a timeline, a structure, a personal story, but it also chains us to the past, to aging, to the fear that one day the story will end. And that is where suffering begins. If we look deeper, we'll see. The mind creates I in every moment. With each thought, it builds another layer, another chapter in a story that never truly began. But the space in which these stories appear, that stillness behind the thoughts, that awareness, that's never been born. It simply is. It was there before the idea of you was formed. It's here now, watching these words arise and dissolve. And it will remain long after the story ends, just as the sky is untouched by the clouds that pass through it. Your true nature is untouched by the illusion of birth and death. So, why does this illusion take root so deeply? Because it serves the ego. It gives the I something to cling to, a timeline, an origin, a place in the world. But if we dare to look beyond it, to ask not just who am I, but what is this I, we begin to see through the veil. And what lies beyond is not nothingness, it's vastness, it's peace. It's the ocean recognizing itself in the ripple. You were not born, you appeared. Like a rainbow after rain, real in its beauty, yet empty of substance. And that is not something to fear. It is something to bow to, because in that emptiness, there is space for everything. No identity to defend, no past to regret, no future to dread, just this, just now, just presence. In the stillness of that truth, the fear begins to dissolve, and something ancient inside you starts to remember. The word death carries a kind of finality that makes us freeze inside. It's the door no one wants to open, the silence no one wants to enter. We speak of it in hushed tones, as if naming it might invite it closer. But what are we really afraid of? Is it the pain, the loss, the unknown, or is it something deeper? The idea that everything we are, everything we've built, loved, felt, suffered for, might simply vanish. Yet what if nothing actually disappears? What if the ending we fear is only a change in costume? What if death is not the opposite of life, but the continuation of it in another form? We have been taught to see death as a cliff, a drop-off, the abrupt moment where something becomes nothing. But the Dharma teaches us something radically different. It invites us to look closer, to question not just what happens at the end, but what the end even means. When a candle burns out, we say, the flame has died. But where did the flame go? Is it really gone? Or has it simply transformed? The heat still radiates in the air. The wax melts into liquid. The smoke curls upward into the sky. The light lingers in memory, gone or just changed. When a wave collapses, it doesn't cease to exist. It becomes part of the sea again. This is not poetic optimism. This is reality seen without delusion. Because in truth, there is no such thing as death, only transformation, only the rearrangement of conditions. What we call death is simply the ending of one visible formation, and the return of its elements to the wider universe. Nothing ever truly disappears, it only shifts. A body decomposes, nourishes the soil, becomes a flower, feeds a bee, gives sweetness to a child, and we say she's gone. But is she? The Buddha didn't ask us to believe in life after death. He asked us to look deeply, to see for ourselves that birth and death are illusions born from limited perception. He once told a grieving woman, desperate to bring back her child, to find a mustard seed from a house untouched by death. She returned empty-handed, and yet awakened, because in seeking what could not be found, she discovered what was always true. Death is not personal, it is universal. and in its universality there is peace. You see, the fear of death doesn't come from death itself. It comes from clinging to identity, to form, to permanence. We cling to this body as me, to our relationships as mine, to our story as something that must be preserved forever. But when we realize we are not just this body, not just this name, not just this collection of fading memories, a strange thing happens. The fear begins to loosen, because how can you die if you were never truly born? What dies is the idea of separation. What dies is the illusion that you were ever something other than the whole. The body, yes, it will fall. The breath, yes, it will stop. The thoughts, memories, sensations, yes, they will dissolve. But the awareness in which all of that appeared remains, the spaciousness, the stillness, the source. Think of a drop of water falling into a river. From the outside, it looks like the drop is gone, but from the inside, it has become the river. It flows on, wider, freer, no longer confined to a shape, but still undeniably present. You are not a thing that ends. You are a movement that changes form. You are the breath before the body. You are the light behind the eyes. You are the awareness that watches the dream, but is never touched by it. And when the body drops, like a leaf returning to the earth, you return to what you never truly left. So the real question is not, what happens when we die? The real question is, who dies? Because if we look deeply enough, we may not find a solid self to lose, only a pattern, only a story, only a reflection dancing on the surface of a river. The deeper current never stops. And when this is seen, not just as an idea, but as a living truth, a profound peace dawns, not because we figured out what happens after death, but because we stopped needing to know. We rest, we trust, we live fully in this moment, not in fear of its ending, but in awe of its unfolding, because what dies is not the real you, only the mask, only the temporary shape, and when that shape dissolves, you return to the formless, the silent, the unshakable. The ocean does not mourn the wave, it simply receives it home. What is the self? This is perhaps the oldest question known to human beings. We wake up inside a body. We feel, we think, we move, and we assume, this is me. But is it? If you stare at a mirror long enough, something strange happens. You begin to wonder who is watching whom. Is the reflection the self, or is the one watching the reflection more real? The Buddha taught that what we commonly call the self is not a solid thing. It's not a soul trapped in a body or a spirit driving a machine. It is a process, a flow, a pattern of conditions constantly in motion. He called it anatta, no self. Not to say there is nothing here, but to say that what's here is not what we think. It's like watching a wave rise from the ocean. The wave has a shape, it has motion, it has direction, we might even give it a name. But if you try to hold the wave in your hand, it slips through your fingers because the wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean in temporary form. The moment we see ourselves as the wave, we suffer, we fear falling. We fight for permanence. We cling to identity, comparison, pride, shame, praise, blame. But when we remember we are also the ocean, something in us finally exhales. Let's look deeper. What do we call me? The body. It changes constantly. Cells die, regenerate. After 7 years, not a single cell is the same. The thoughts, they come and go like clouds in a windy sky. You can't even predict your next thought. The emotions. One moment joy, the next sorrow. They rise, they fall, not stable, not yours to command. The memories, fragments, selective, fading, rewritten every time they're recalled. So, where is the fixed self? If every part of me is changing, then what is truly I? We begin to realize something profound. The self is not a thing, it's a story held together by habit, language, and fear. And while it feels real, oh yes, it feels real, that doesn't make it true. The wave believes it's separate only because it can't yet see the vastness beneath it. But once it pauses, once it looks inward instead of outward, it begins to sense something deeper, something unmoving, silent, boundless. This is the ocean. This is the true self, not a person, not an identity, but pure awareness. Consciousness itself, unshaped, unlimited, untouched by the comings and goings of the world. You have tasted this. In moments of stillness, in deep meditation, in the breath before a thought arises, in the space between two heartbeats, that quiet, that presence, that vast knowing, it has no name, no story, no agenda, and yet, it is you. Not the little you, the temporary character playing a role, but the great you, the one who sees it all without needing to grasp any of it. When a wave knows it is the ocean, it no longer fears crashing. It knows it cannot die, because it was never separate to begin with, and so it dances, freely, joyfully, with full expression but no attachment. This is what awakening means. Not escaping the world but seeing it clearly. Not denying the wave but understanding it's made of water. And you are that water. You are the silent ocean beneath every rise and fall, the stillness behind every breath, the unchanging presence that watches it all yet is bound by none of it. No fear, no clinging, no chasing, just peace, just now, just this. Look around you. Everything you see, this moment, this breath, this body, even the stars above, is in motion. Everything is changing, constantly, silently, relentlessly. Nothing in the universe stays still. Nothing lasts exactly as it is, not even for a second. This isn't just a teaching from Buddhism. It's a fundamental truth of physics, from galaxies spinning light years away, to atoms vibrating within your skin. The entire cosmos is a dance of transformation. Yet we live as if things are solid, stable, graspable. We fall in love with what is fleeting. We build our identities around form. We chase permanence in a world that was never designed to hold it. Why? Because our minds long for certainty, and certainty gives us comfort. But comfort is not the same as truth. The Buddha called this constant flux anicca, impermanence, and he pointed to it not to frighten us but to free us. Because it's in misunderstanding impermanence that suffering takes root. We fear loss. Because we believe things are supposed to stay, we fear death. Because we think life is something we can hold on to, we fear change. Because we imagine there was ever such a thing as control. But what if we looked at impermanence not as a threat, but as a teacher? What if change is not the problem, but our resistance to it is? Science echoes this truth. Everything that appears solid is, at its core, mostly empty space. Your body, your table, even a mountain. Zoom in far enough and matter disappears into movement, energy, and probability. Particles blink in and out of existence. Energy transforms but is never destroyed. Even time is not a fixed backdrop. It stretches, curves, collapses. The physicists call it entropy, the natural tendency of systems to evolve, decay, shift. But Buddhism called it emptiness, sunyata, not meaning nothingness, but the absence of independent, unchanging essence. Everything depends on everything else. This arises because that arises. When this fades, that fades too. No fixed self. No separate thing. No core that remains untouched by the flow. You are not separate from this process. You are the process, a wave of conditions, a ripple in space-time, a fleeting yet sacred moment in the unfolding of the cosmos. And this is beautiful, because if nothing is permanent, then nothing can truly be lost. It simply becomes something else. The tree becomes smoke, the smoke becomes cloud, the cloud becomes rain, the rain becomes the river, and the river perhaps becomes tears on someone's cheek, Nothing is ever truly gone, it only changes costumes. In the West, we've tried to conquer impermanence. We build monuments, we record memories, we preserve bodies. We cling to youth. We resist wrinkles as if they are signs of failure. But in the East, particularly in Buddhism, impermanence is seen as sacred. The cherry blossom falls not because it is weak, but because its fall is part of its beauty. It's the falling that teaches us how to let go, how to love without clinging, how to live without fear. A physicist might say, "This moment will never come again." A Buddhist might reply, "Exactly, that's why it is so precious." We don't need to become monks or scientists to see this. Just look. Look at how the breath enters and leaves, ungraspable. How a thought rises and vanishes before it can be captured. How even the person you were yesterday is already gone. And yet here you are, still unfolding. There is no solid you behind the eyes, just layers of memory, sensation, habit, constantly rearranged. But if everything is impermanent, then who suffers? If the self is always changing, then who exactly is holding on to pain? This is the key. When you realize the one who clings is also impermanent, you begin to loosen your grip. You stop clinging to the wave, and you start feeling the ocean again, the emptiness that physics points to, the interdependence that science proves, the fleeting, miraculous nature of every form. All of it points back to one core insight. You are not a thing in the world. You are the unfolding of the world itself. And that unfolding doesn't need to be permanent to be meaningful. Its beauty lies in its transience. Its truth lies in its motion. Its sacredness lies in its emptiness. So when the wave falls, don't mourn it, celebrate. It has returned to what it always was, and so will you. The moment we realize we are not solid, not fixed, not separate, something inside us resists, because even when we suffer, we still cling to the idea of me. That voice in your head that says, "This is who I am. This is what happened to me. This is what I deserve, what I fear, what I want." It feels so real, so permanent, so personal. But what if that voice isn't you? What if the self you defend, define, and drag through life isn't the one that's truly alive? Most people live like someone wearing a mask for so long. They forget what their real face ever looked like. And that mask, that's the false self, constructed from stories, wrapped in opinions, polished by social expectation, fueled by fear. It's the version of you that says, "I need to be seen. I need to be right. I need to be someone." But underneath that, before the story began, you were already whole. Buddhism teaches that this false self is the root of suffering. Because when we believe we are the story, we become trapped in its limits. We defend the self-image at all costs, avoiding anything that might crack it. Failure, rejection, loss, aging, all become threats to our imagined identity. But here's the paradox. The tighter we cling to this idea of me, the more we suffer. Because the world doesn't serve the ego, it transforms it. It undoes what's false, so that what's real can finally breathe. Letting go of the false self is not erasing who you are. It's remembering what you've always been beneath the noise. It's peeling back the layers that were never truly yours, the labels you inherited, the pain you personalized, the roles you performed, the armor you wore to survive. Letting go means you no longer need to impress, prove, or pretend. You no longer need to carry the weight of an identity designed to win approval. You return to something quieter, simpler, truer, like space before it became form, like water before it became a wave. But don't mistake this for emptiness in the Western sense. This is not nihilism. This is liberation. Because once the false self falls away, you're no longer bound by the fears that kept it alive. You don't have to be the smartest, the most successful, the most liked. You don't have to chase happiness like a hungry ghost. You don't even have to be someone. You can just be, and from that place, love becomes more pure. Joy becomes more subtle. Compassion flows naturally because it's no longer filtered through the lens of ego. In the silence that follows letting go, you begin to hear something you hadn't noticed in a long time. Your true self. Not the self that wants something, but the one that witnesses everything with clarity and peace. The part of you that has never changed, no matter how many roles you played. The silent observer behind your thoughts. The deep stillness underneath your emotions. You feel it most clearly when you're alone in nature. When you're listening to music that speaks to your soul. When you're holding the hand of someone in pain and you forget yourself entirely. That's it. That's the real you, and the path to finding it is not adding more. It's subtracting what is false. This is why the Buddha didn't say, "Find your true self." He said, "Let go of what you are not." And when you do, what remains is not small or weak or bland. What remains is free. Free from the fear of death. Free from the ache of comparison. Free from the craving to become someone. You are already enough. Not because of anything you've done, but because your very nature is awareness itself. You are not the story. You are the space in which the story unfolds. And the more you rest in that space, the more life opens, not as something to conquer, but as something to participate in, fully, gratefully, lovingly. So here's a gentle truth. To be free, you don't have to become someone new. You just have to stop being who you're not. And when you do, you don't lose yourself. You finally find the part of you that was never lost. There is a doorway, but it doesn't open outward, it opens inward. And strangely, it has no lock, only the illusion that it is closed. We search for the sacred in distant temples, in books, in gurus, in mountaintops and monasteries. But we often overlook the one place where eternity has always been waiting. Right here, right now, this very moment, not the next breath, not the next breakthrough, not when things are finally perfect, but this unassuming sliver of now. So ordinary, it's almost invisible. And yet if you pause, just long enough to notice it, you'll find something astonishing. Eternity is hiding in the present moment, not in some mystical otherworld, but woven into the fabric of the now. You see, the mind doesn't like the present. It's addicted to time. It clings to the past like a scrapbook of wounds and glories. It grasps at the future like a hungry ghost reaching for the next high. And in doing so, it misses the only place where life is actually happening. Because the present moment is not a stepping stone, it's the destination. In Buddhism, we don't practice to escape life. We practice to arrive in it, right here. Without judgment, without agenda, without needing anything to be different, just breathing and being. And the miracle, when we truly arrive, we discover that this moment is not just a moment. It is the gateway to the timeless. Think about it. Everything you've ever experienced, love, loss, awe, silence, only happened in the now. Even memories, even dreams, they all unfold within awareness in this moment. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the present isn't fleeting. Our attention is. But if we train our attention to stay, to rest gently in the now, like a leaf on water, something shifts. Suddenly, the ordinary becomes luminous. A sip of tea becomes sacred. A breeze on your skin feels like a whisper from the infinite. Even the silence between words begins to speak. Because when you're fully present, you touch the eternal. Time loses its grip. Ego loses its urgency. And something deeper opens. In that stillness, you're no longer separate from life. You are life. The breath is no longer your breath. It is the breath of the universe, rising and falling through the illusion of you. The sound of the birds is not outside you. It's within awareness, just like your thoughts. And for a moment, a pure, fleeting, holy moment, you disappear into what has always been. And that is what the mystics meant when they spoke of eternity. Not endless time, but timeless presence. Not some golden realm far away, but this very moment, seen clearly and touched with the heart. But we don't stay there, we forget. We drift, and that's okay. The practice is not to be perfect. The practice is to return, again and again, with tenderness, with humility, with love. Because every time you return to the now, you peel back another layer of illusion. You step out of the fog of becoming and into the clarity of simply being, and slowly, you begin to live your life from that space. Not reaching, not regretting, but simply responding with wisdom, with compassion, with peace. You walk slower. You listen deeper. You speak less but mean more. And you realize it was never about achieving some perfect self. It was always about waking up to the sacredness of the selfless moment. The eternal is not found in the stars. It's found in the stillness between your thoughts, in the kindness of your touch, in the breath that moves through you now. And now, so pause, let go, and listen. This moment, just as it is enough. It begins quietly, not with fireworks, not with fanfare, but with a soft, almost imperceptible shift. From surviving to being, from grasping to trusting, from fearing life's impermanence to flowing with it, like a leaf surrendered to the river. That's what happens when the illusion of separateness begins to dissolve. You don't just understand impermanence with your mind. You feel it in your bones. You breathe it in and exhale freedom. This is the power of insight. But insight alone is not enough. A moment of awakening is precious, but it's in the living of that insight where the real transformation unfolds. Because the real question is not, can I see the truth? It's, can I live it? Can you carry the knowing of no birth, no death, into a world obsessed with beginnings and endings? Can you walk among attachments without letting them fasten around your heart? Can you lose things, your job, your youth, your loved ones, without losing yourself? That's the test. That's the path. That's the art of living without fear or attachment. It doesn't mean becoming numb. It doesn't mean abandoning love. It means loving without clinging, caring without controlling, acting without ego at the center. Because when you're no longer protecting a fixed identity, you become fluid. Like water, like wind, you don't react to life. You respond. There's a calmness in your presence, not because you've conquered fear, but because you've stopped resisting it. You've seen that fear is just thought, just movement, just mind trying to grasp something solid in a world made of waves. And so you smile, not because life is always easy, but because you're no longer demanding that it be. You stop saying, "This should not be happening to me." Instead, you ask, "What is this moment asking of me?" You open to what is, even when it hurts, even when it shakes you, especially then, because that's when your insight becomes real. When someone betrays you and instead of collapsing, you notice the contraction in your chest and breathe into it. When you feel envy rise like fire, and instead of judging yourself, you gently observe, this too is impermanent. When someone you love is dying, and you sit by their side, not trying to hold on, but simply holding space. This is how the practice leaves the cushion and enters your kitchen, your office, your relationships. This is how the sacred meets the ordinary. You become the one who listens deeply, who slows down, who doesn't rush to fix, who doesn't need to win the argument, because you're no longer living from the hunger of ego. You're living from the fullness of being. And slowly, the world around you begins to change, not because you force it, but because your presence has become a refuge. For others and for yourself, you are no longer terrified of change. Because you are change, You are no longer afraid of loss, because nothing truly belongs to you. You are no longer shaken by endings, because you've seen through the illusion of beginnings. You are life. In all its rising and falling, you are the sky, not the weather. And in this realization, there's a quiet kind of power, not loud, not boastful, but unshakable. The power of one who is no longer defending a self that doesn't exist, one who moves through the world, with hands open, not clenched, with eyes soft, and heart wide. This is freedom, not in some distant monastery, but right here, in your Monday mornings, your messy conversations, your aging body, your breaking heart. Freedom is not escape, it's intimacy with life. As it is, so we practice, we forget, we remember, we return again and again and again. Each moment, an invitation to let go a little more and live a little deeper. When we first hear the word compassion, we often picture it as something we must do, an effort, a choice, a noble response to the suffering of others. But when insight cuts deeply, when the veil between self and other begins to dissolve, compassion is no longer something we do. It's what we are. It arises not from guilt, not from duty, but from the profound realization that there is no solid boundary between you and me, that your suffering is not separate from mine, that your tears are not foreign, that the pain you carry in your chest has the same texture as what I've known in mine. And suddenly, something shifts. You stop judging people's pain. You stop asking if they deserve your kindness. You stop protecting yourself behind stories like, "They brought this upon themselves," or "It's not my problem," because the wall is gone. Because now, when you see a homeless man shaking from cold, you feel the cold in your own bones. When you hear a child crying in fear, your own nervous system trembles. When you witness cruelty, not just in war zones, but in casual words, in dismissive looks, in moments of silence that should have been care, your heart aches not out of pity, but out of recognition. You remember, we are not separate, and in that remembering, compassion is born, not soft, not sentimental, but strong, raw, vast, a compassion that doesn't turn away, even when the suffering is ugly, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's your own, because the more deeply you see into the nature of reality, into impermanence, into interbeing, into no self, the more compassion becomes the only sane response. And that response doesn't always look like giving a hug. Sometimes it looks like holding someone accountable, because that too is love. Sometimes it means saying no. Sometimes it means walking away. Sometimes it means sitting in silence, not rushing to fix, but simply being with what is. Because compassion is not weakness. It is the courage to be fully present with suffering without needing to escape it. It is the quiet power of staying open, even when your instinct is to shut down. It is the wisdom to know that the person who just hurt you is also carrying an ancient wound. And even if you must protect yourself, you don't have to hate them. You just see more clearly. You see that every human being, even the difficult ones, is a wave in the same ocean you are. You see that healing doesn't happen by attacking waves. It happens when we remember the water. And so compassion becomes a path, a presence, a practice. You start with yourself. You stop making war with your mind. You stop punishing yourself for not being more enlightened. You speak gently to your fear, your sadness, your unmet longings. You learn to sit with your pain as you would sit with a crying child. Not to make it shut up, but to let it know it's not alone. And from that place, your compassion radiates outward, not as an effort, but as a natural consequence of clarity. You become someone who moves through the world differently, not because you're trying to be good, but because you've touched something true. You've touched the trembling heart of life itself. And now, you cannot ignore it. You look at the suffering in the world, the loneliness, the injustice, the cruelty, and you don't turn away. You lean in, not because it's easy, but because you've realized that the more deeply you understand emptiness, the more deeply you feel everything. Emptiness is not numbness, it is intimacy. The insight of no self does not erase love. It makes love boundless. And so you love, not with possession, not with attachment, but with the full knowing that nothing lasts. And therefore, everything matters, even a smile, even a kind word, even just holding eye contact with someone the world has forgotten. Because when you see clearly, you realize even the smallest gesture of compassion ripples through eternity. Even a whisper of kindness can echo into someone's final moment. And what else is there really? But this, to understand, to connect, to awaken, to love. This is the gift of deep insight. Not to transcend humanity, but to embrace it more fully than ever before. We've spent a long time searching for truth, for meaning, for a place to rest. We've asked, who am I? Where do I go when I die? Where did I come from? But now, at the end of the road, something becomes startlingly clear. There was never anywhere to go, and there was never anyone coming. No coming, no going. These are not just poetic words. They are the direct pointing to the unshakable truth that nothing is truly born, and nothing ever truly dies. Like waves on the ocean, we rise for a moment, shimmer under the sunlight, then return. But the wave was never separate from the water. It was water all along, and so are we. When the Buddha smiled beneath the Bodhi tree, he did not find a path that led somewhere else. He saw that there was nowhere else to go, that this moment, this breath, this life exactly as it is already complete, not needing to be fixed, not needing to be added to, just needing to be seen. Clearly, when we believe in birth, we become attached to identity. When we believe in death, we become terrified of loss. But when both dissolve, a freedom arises that can't be shaken, a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, a peace that doesn't come and go. This is the final liberation, not somewhere out there in the heavens, but here, in a single step, a single smile, a single mindful breath. You are not a visitor in this universe. You are not a spark that will fade into darkness. You are life itself. You are the breath of the cosmos, momentarily dancing in human form. So grieve when grief comes. Laugh when joy arrives. Love with your whole heart. But do not cling, do not be afraid, because what you truly are was never born and can never die. There is no coming, no going, only the eternal unfolding of what already is, right here, right now. If these reflections touched something deep within you, if even one phrase opened a quiet doorway in your heart, then this space was meant for you. This is Zen Buddhism wisdom, a home for stillness, for depth, for truth that doesn't shout. If your soul is drawn to this kind of silence, this kind of clarity, you're invited to stay, subscribe, so we can keep walking this path together, not chasing, but returning to the place we never truly left. Until next time, may you walk in peace, may you breathe with awareness, and may you remember, you are the ocean, not just the wave.